The worst part wasn't the silence. It was the little red hat still hanging from the fence behind Birchwood Elementary. Rain-soaked, unmoving, waiting for a hand that never came. No scream, no witness. Just a torn piece of drawing paper fluttering in the wind, and the emptiness where Madison Green, 8 years old, had been standing minutes earlier. She was small, quiet, and known for never being late. Favorite shoes? Purple high tops. Favorite color? Green. She always waited near the swing set until 4:15 p.m. Sharp, except today. At 4:22, her teacher noticed her desk still had her coat. At 4:35, her mother was driving the back roads, calling her name. By 5 o'clock, yellow tape wrapped the field, and Ranger, the blind German shepherd once thought too broken to return to duty, was already waiting at the edge of the woods. Because sometimes, the only thing sharper than sight is the instinct to not walk away. Chapter 1. Black blindfold in the wheat field. Birchwood, North Carolina. Late October. The wind came low and steady across the golden wheat fields that framed the outskirts of Birchwood, a quiet, fog-kissed town in the western hills of North Carolina. It was late October, and though the trees had begun to turn, the skies had lost their warmth, gray, sunless, waiting. In the far corners of town, porch lights flickered on early. But somewhere behind Birchwood Elementary School, a little girl did not come home. Madison Green was 8 years old, a child of stillness and bright color. She wore her emotions like stickers on a lunchbox, proudly, without filter. Her hair was a tumble of soft brown curls, often braided down her back with tiny purple clips. That day she wore her favorite wool hat, red and oversized, given to her by her grandfather just 2 weeks before he passed. She had been playing by herself, in the patchy yard behind the school, sketchbook in hand as always. She was known for her drawings, little windows into her imagination. By 4:25 p.m., her mother had arrived at the pickup line and waited. By 4:40, the calls began. By 5 o'clock, the sheriff's department had sealed off the playground, and the sun had dropped low over the town's slanted rooftops. Deputy Mark Dawson stood just inside the yellow tape, staring at the single red hat caught on a splintered fence post like a torn flag. Below it, barely clinging to the October breeze, was half a crumpled sheet of white paper, a child's drawing, ripped clean down the center. One side remained, a small stick figure of a girl holding hands with something rectangular and dark. The rest had blown away. Mark was a man built from quiet weight. 38 years old, tall, thick-framed, with shoulders that sagged slightly under a badge worn too long. His face was sun-worn, expression unreadable, his jaw tight beneath a faint layer of stubble. Since losing his wife in a sudden accident 2 years earlier, Mark had raised his 10-year-old daughter, Emily, alone, not so much with warmth as with structure, with routine. A man of function, not poetry. He turned to the deputy beside him, gave a short nod, and walked back to his vehicle without a word. Inside the rear compartment of his SUV sat a crate, metal, quiet. The latch was firm, the air around it still. Mark exhaled slowly, then opened it. Out stepped Ranger. Once a decorated K-9 with the county's search and rescue unit, Ranger was a German shepherd of old bloodline, broad, muscular, and unmistakably dignified, despite the scars across his face and the black cloth that wrapped firmly over his eyes. Blind now, for over 3 years, due to a collapse during a tunnel rescue, Ranger had since been retired, yet his ears were sharp, his gait cautious but deliberate, and his presence still commanded silence. Mark knelt down, brushing the side of the dog's face with a rough palm. "One more," he murmured. "That little girl needs you." Ranger lowered his head, nose twitching into the cold wind, and took his first step forward. Across the schoolyard, April Quinn was gathering drawings from the hallway corkboards, her expression thoughtful. April 27th was Birchwood Elementary's new art teacher. She had auburn hair, neatly cropped above her shoulders, and a style of dress that leaned toward muted scarves, corduroy skirts, and gentle jewelry. Practical softness. She had arrived from Raleigh only a few months earlier, eager for peace, though she rarely spoke of her younger sister, who had gone missing 5 years ago. Since then, April had grown cautious with patterns, especially in children. Today she noticed one. 5 separate students had turned in drawings over the past 2 weeks that included a black SUV, each parked in different corners of the schoolyard. At first, April thought it was just coincidence, or a shared image from television. But now, with Madison missing, she couldn't shake the chill that crept along her spine as she reviewed them again. The images weren't the same, but the angle was. The SUV was always drawn from behind, near the edge of the page, watching. April pulled out her phone and quietly photographed each one. When she reached Madison's desk, the seat was empty, her drawing half finished in the bin. Same thick wheels, same shadowy windows. She frowned and whispered, "Please let this be nothing." Back in the wheat field, Ranger had begun to circle. Mark walked behind him, eyes alert. The dog's blindfold didn't slow him. He moved by scent, by memory, by something Mark never fully understood. After 15 minutes, Ranger paused at the fence where the red hat had been found. He sniffed once, then sat, silent. Mark glanced up at the horizon. The light was fading fast. The wind had grown sharper, pulling the smell of dry grass across the yard. From the east, clouds gathered over the hills. He looked down at Ranger. "You feel it too, don't you?" Ranger didn't bark. He never did. But the stillness in his posture said enough. Somewhere out there, a little girl waited, and the dog who could no longer see would be the one to find her. Chapter 2. The Whisper Beneath the Eastern Woods. The morning after Madison's disappearance was thick with cloud cover. The sky above Birchwood bled the dullest gray, and the sun struggled to rise behind it. A thin mist hovered over the wheat fields and drifted through the pine-lined road that wound toward the old covered bridge east of town. The search had resumed at dawn, boots crunching across frosted grass, radios crackling with names and grid coordinates. Deputy Mark Dawson hadn't slept. Neither had Ranger. The dog walked low to the ground, guided only by scent and instinct, his black blindfold damp with dew. His movements were slow but sure, the leash loose in Mark's hand as they followed the path toward the far tree line. Volunteers were sweeping the school perimeter again, still convinced that Madison couldn't have gone far. But Ranger was heading in the opposite direction, toward the woods behind the maintenance road, toward the bridge no one had considered. That bridge hadn't been used in years, ever since the county rerouted the highway. It creaked now under the weight of time and moisture, its floorboards slick with moss and rain. Mark followed Ranger across the bridge and down the slope beneath it, where a shallow creek carved through the underbrush. The air was colder here, and the sounds of the search faded into silence. Beneath the bridge, nestled into the earth and half hidden by a curtain of dead vines, lay a wide concrete drain pipe. Ranger stopped at the mouth of the pipe. He didn't bark. He didn't move. He just lowered his body slowly and let out a single, low whimper. Mark narrowed his eyes. The pipe was large enough for a child to crawl into, and dark enough to swallow anything whole. He knelt beside Ranger and pulled a flashlight from his belt, shining it into the hollow. Only damp concrete met his beam. No movement, no sound. He leaned back and spoke softly. "Is this where she went, boy?" Ranger didn't respond. He simply laid his head on his paws, his ears angled forward, eyes hidden beneath black cloth, but locked on the shadows inside. Mark turned to call in a team, but hesitated. They had already searched drainage routes, and it would sound absurd to redirect based on a blind dog's hunch. Still, something about Ranger's stillness unnerved him. "I'll mark it," he muttered, setting a bright orange flag near the entrance. "We'll come back." But as Mark rose and tugged lightly at the leash, Ranger refused to move. At Birchwood Elementary, April Quinn stood in the staff copy room, the dim fluorescence flickering slightly above her. Her fingers trembled as she held Madison Green's student file open across the table. She hadn't meant to break protocol. Teachers weren't supposed to access confidential reports, but she had asked the secretary, kindly but firmly, to retrieve Madison's behavioral notes. What she saw wasn't what she remembered. April was sure that, just 2 weeks ago, Madison had brought her a folded letter during free drawing time. "I made this for you," the girl had said shyly, cheeks flushed. It was a little envelope fashioned from notebook paper, taped shut at the edges. Inside had been a simple crooked message written in pencil. "There's a man who watches from the fence. He doesn't blink. April had brought the letter to the principal at the time, only to be told it was a product of a child's imagination. She reads too many mystery books, the principal had laughed. But now, that letter was nowhere in the file, and the behavioral notes had been rewritten, sanitized. A generic entry about playground anxiety was dated for the same week April had received Madison's note. Someone had altered it. April's heart raced. She placed the file back into the cabinet and stepped into the hallway, where she almost bumped into Principal Gerald Simmons. Simmons was in his mid-50s, with a polished look that bordered on too perfect: gray suit, red tie, neat silver hair combed back, and a voice as warm and empty as a politician's promise. He smiled as he saw her, but it didn't reach his eyes. "Ms. Quinn," he said, "you're here early." "Just trying to catch up," she replied, hiding her nerves behind a thin smile. "Anything I can help with?" "No, thank you." "Good. And April. Let's remember to respect privacy boundaries, yes? We don't want to alarm parents unnecessarily." She froze. Of course." Simmons nodded once and walked past her down the hall, his shoes echoing too loudly on the tile. Once he was gone, April hurried outside, heart thudding. She took out her phone and scrolled through her camera roll. The photo she'd taken of Madison's letter 2 weeks ago was still there. Unedited, undeniable. She didn't go back inside. Instead, she drove to the sheriff's department. Mark sat in his cruiser near the edge of the field, coffee untouched, watching as Ranger paced restlessly just outside the vehicle. The dog had returned to the same spot near the bridge 3 times that morning, pulling at the leash, then lying back down again. All right, Mark muttered. "We'll take another look." Before he could start the engine, April tapped on his window. Mark opened the door, surprised. "Ms. Quinn?" April looked pale, wind in her face, phone clenched in one hand. "I need to show you something," she said. "It's about Madison." Inside the station conference room, April laid out the evidence, the altered file, the missing note, and finally, the photo on her phone. Mark stared at it in silence. "She told me there was a man watching from the fence," April said. "The letter's gone from her record. Someone removed it." Mark looked up slowly, then pulled out a printed grid map of the school grounds. "Ranger keeps returning to this old drainage pipe east of the bridge. It's outside the school's perimeter, but close enough for a line of sight. If someone was watching—" He trailed off. April nodded. "Then he knew where the children played, and he might have seen Madison alone." Mark picked up his radio. "I'm calling in backup." That evening, as dusk fell again over Birchwood, Mark and Ranger stood once more at the mouth of the drain pipe. This time, a portable floodlight illuminated the interior, and 2 deputies knelt beside them, scanning inside with thermal scopes. Nothing. Still, Ranger didn't leave, and neither did Mark. ChatGPT John Noy, Chepater Bay, Tainho Va Men Bak, the Mua Roi Trong Hung Man Mong Tran, Birchwood Ngam Thum La Tong Va Bien Juong Ji Thang Bun. It had been nearly 48 hours since Madison Green disappeared, and still, no one had dared to say what everyone was thinking, that maybe it was too late, that maybe this would end like the stories that never left the sheriff's board, where pins and photos stayed up long after hope had gone. Deputy Mark Dawson hadn't left the site near the bridge, not even once. His boots were caked in dried mud, his coat drenched, his eyes hollow from 2 nights of standing vigil. Beside him lay Ranger, the blind German shepherd, curled near the mouth of the old concrete drain pipe like a stone statue, unmoving in the rain. The black blindfold covering his eyes was soaked, but he didn't flinch. The other officers had long moved their focus elsewhere. The eastern woods had been swept twice. The drone coverage marked the pipe as clear, but Ranger had refused to leave it, and Mark trusted the dog more than he trusted any camera. He stood there now, flashlight off, rain slipping down the back of his neck, watching the dark hole that had swallowed so much silence. Then he heard it. Not a voice, not a cry, a tap, then another. Mark's breath caught in his throat. He stepped closer to the pipe, crouched low, one hand gripping the edge of the concrete as the rain pelted his back. His other hand reached slowly into his jacket for the flashlight. Another tap. He switched the light on and pointed it inside. For a moment, only darkness stared back. Then, movement. A small hand, pale, trembling, emerged from the shadows, fingers curled with effort, reaching toward the light like it might burn away the fear. The sleeve was soaked, the fabric torn at the edge. Mark dropped the flashlight and scrambled forward. "Madison?" he called, voice hoarse. The hand flinched. "It's all right. I'm here. You're safe now." Mark pulled out his radio, nearly fumbling it. "I've got her. Alive. Send medical now." Behind him, Ranger rose slowly to his feet. Though he couldn't see the girl, he took 2 careful steps forward and lowered his head, waiting. The response team arrived in minutes, flashing lights bleeding across the trees, footsteps rushing down the slope. Paramedic voices cut through the rain as they gently pulled Madison from the pipe. She was small, fragile in a way that hurt to witness. Her hair was matted to her forehead, her lips chapped, her fingers clenched tightly in a protective curl. They wrapped her in a silver emergency blanket that crinkled softly with each movement. Mark stepped forward. Madison's eyes found his, then turned to Ranger. "He didn't bark," she whispered, her voice raw. "But I heard him. I waited because I heard him." She looked at Mark again. "He stayed, didn't he?" Mark nodded, throat tight. "He never left." Elsewhere in town, April Quinn stood inside her apartment above the florist's shop. The heater hummed faintly in the background, but she hadn't moved in 10 minutes. Her hands trembled slightly as she unfolded the letter she had found shoved under her door that morning. No return address, no name, just plain white paper, typed in a font too clean, too precise. "Stop asking questions. People forget for a reason." She read it again. And again. April had seen warnings before, when her sister disappeared 5 years ago. Back then, the police called it a runaway. She knew better, and she remembered the silence that followed when she kept asking questions. Now, it was happening again. April reached for her coat, heart pounding, but just as her hand touched the doorknob, there was a knock. She paused, then opened it slowly. Outside stood Ellie Martin, a quiet 4th grader from her art class. Ellie was 9, with long, curly blonde hair and an oversized yellow raincoat that swallowed her small frame. She didn't say anything at first, just held out a folded drawing in both hands. April took it carefully. "I saw him," Ellie said softly. "Near the trees, on Friday." April knelt to meet her gaze. "What did you see, sweetheart?" Ellie pointed at the drawing. It showed a man in a baseball cap, standing near what looked like a crooked road leading into a large, broken-down building. The trees were drawn thick around it, and in the corner, Ellie had written one word: warehouse. April looked back at the girl, stunned. "Did you tell anyone?" Ellie shook her head. "They said I dreamed too much." April hugged her gently. "You did the right thing." Back at the sheriff's department, Mark sat beside Ranger, a towel over the dog's back as they waited for the medical report. Madison had been taken to the hospital. She was stable, cold, starving, but alive. He closed his eyes briefly. Footsteps approached. It was April. She entered the room with her hair still damp from the rain and handed him the drawing. Mark studied it in silence. "She saw him," April said. Same description Madison gave. Hoodie, captain. He followed her. This path. It leads to the old lumber warehouse north of town. Mark nodded slowly. "I know it. Nobody's used that road in years." They exchanged a look. April added more quietly, "Someone doesn't want us asking questions." Mark looked down at Ranger, who now lay curled beside the desk, tail occasionally tapping the floor in slow rhythm. "Well," he said, voice firm, "let's keep asking." Chapter 4. The Watcher in the Dark. The morning fog clung to Birchwood like a secret, curling around the low rooftops and softening the sound of tires rolling along gravel roads. It was Sunday. Church bells echoed faintly from the southern ridge, and in the eastern part of town, beyond the wheat fields and behind the abandoned sawmill, the earth held a silence too dense to be natural. Mark Dawson drove without speaking. Ranger sat beside him in the cruiser, his blindfold still damp from last night's rain, ears perked as if he could hear the very thoughts behind every tree they passed. In the back seat, April Quinn leaned forward, the drawing from Ellie Martin clutched in her hands. They reached the warehouse just before 7 a.m. It was a gray, sagging structure, 2 stories of weather-worn siding, partially collapsed roof, rusted gutters hanging like broken ribs. Tall grass surrounded the building, hiding a dirt driveway long overtaken by moss. Mark cut the engine. The air outside was still and thick, not with cold, but something more fragile, a hush, like the forest was waiting to exhale. "We go quiet," Mark said. "No lights, no noise unless necessary." April nodded, already pulling on gloves. Ranger hopped down from the cruiser without hesitation, nose to the wind. He paused, then began walking toward the far side of the building. They followed. The side entrance had no lock, just a bent metal latch someone had forced open. Inside, the warehouse smelled of old rain, mold, and faint traces of gasoline. Light filtered through broken windows, illuminating dust hanging like smoke. They stepped around broken pallets, decayed insulation, and long-forgotten tools. Then Ranger stopped. He stood motionless in the corner of the room, near a stack of crates covered in a faded blue tarp. Mark moved slowly, lifted the edge of the plastic. Beneath it lay a child's backpack. Beside it, a pink mitten, a pair of small shoes, a handheld camera, and a rolled map with ink markings. April crouched down, breath caught. The map was of Birchwood Elementary. Highlighted in red were multiple areas: the playground, the fence perimeter, the bike racks, and the eastern field where Madison had vanished. Mark reached for the camera and pressed the power button. It clicked but did not light up. Dead battery. He slipped it into his coat pocket. April stood and looked around. "This isn't random. Someone was planning, watching." Mark nodded grimly. "A prep site." He scanned the rest of the space. No bed, no food, just scattered belongings, all linked to children. "This isn't where he keeps them," Mark said. "It's where he studies them." Later that day, Mark sat with Sheriff Alan Strickland in the town's government building. Strickland was in his early 60s, short and broad-shouldered with deep crow's feet from years of squinting into sun and disappointment. A lifelong Birchwood man, Strickland was the kind of sheriff who believed in firm handshakes and quiet fixes. When Mark presented the evidence, the backpack, the map, the child's shoes, the sheriff rubbed his temples and exhaled long and slow. "We'll log it, file it, run for fingerprints," he muttered. "But we can't blow this wide open." Mark stiffened. "We found a surveillance station on school grounds, Alan. Someone stalking children." "And if we announce that," Strickland said, voice low, "we incite panic. Media trucks, parents pulling kids out of school. You want to be the one to tell Mrs. Crane her preschool's now a target zone?" Mark's jaw clenched. "I want to stop this before another kid disappears." Strickland met his gaze. "Then do it quietly. The town doesn't need fear. It needs control." Mark left the room without replying. At home that evening, Mark's daughter Emily sat cross-legged on the floor of the living room, sketching quietly with colored pencils. Emily was 10, with a quiet nature and wide brown eyes that always seemed to notice more than she said. She was slender, with shoulder-length hair usually tied into a low ponytail, and a habit of humming when nervous. April visited shortly after dusk. Emily looked up and smiled, shy but warm. "Hi, Miss Quinn." "Hi, sweetheart," April replied gently. "Your dad said you wanted to show me something." Emily nodded and picked up a folded piece of paper from the coffee table. She unfolded it carefully, revealing a hand-drawn map of the school grounds, done in surprising detail for a child her age. "I saw the black car again," Emily said softly. "It was near the swings last week, but nobody else saw it." April leaned in. "You remembered where it parked?" Emily pointed at the corner of the map, just behind the bike racks. "That's where Madison was last seen," April whispered, eyes wide. Mark, standing by the hallway door, walked forward slowly. "Emily, why didn't you tell me before?" "I didn't want you to be worried," she said, looking down. "You already worry a lot." Mark knelt beside her. "You're never a worry, Em. You're the reason I do all this." Ranger, who had been lying near the fireplace, lifted his head at the sound of Mark's voice. Emily turned to him and gently placed her drawing on the floor beside his paws. "He's the only one who saw it too. I think he remembers." Ranger reached forward with his nose, nudging the map lightly. His tail thumped once against the floor. April took out her phone and snapped a photo of the drawing. "This matches what we found at the warehouse," she said to Mark. He nodded. "That building was just one of many. There could be more prep stations, more targets." April's voice dropped. "And he's still out there." That night, as rain began again to fall across the town, Mark sat alone at the kitchen table, Ranger at his feet. The blind dog lay still, but not asleep. His ears twitched occasionally toward sounds no one else could hear. On the table were photos: the warehouse interior, the map, the pink mitten, and now Emily's drawing. Mark didn't speak, but he didn't have to. Ranger was already on alert, and the watcher in the dark hadn't made his last move. Chapter 5. Ranger. The hero. Without sight. The sky over Birchwood was still dark when Deputy Mark Dawson parked his cruiser near Waverly Park, a small stretch of fenced green space on the town's southern edge. The sun hadn't yet crested the horizon, but the street lamps cast long shadows across the empty playground, their pale orange glow flickering softly. Ranger sat silently beside Mark in the front seat, the black blindfold still tied snugly across his eyes. The blind dog's posture was still, but alert. His ears shifted slightly, scanning every sound. Across the street, a man had arrived minutes earlier. Medium build, clean sneakers, a gray hoodie pulled tight around his face. He sat on a warped wooden bench near the slide, a worn black backpack resting between his legs. His head stayed down. He didn't move much, but Mark had seen enough from the warehouse evidence, the map markings, the gloves, the positioning, to know this wasn't just a jogger waiting for sunrise. April Quinn had tipped him off an hour earlier. She'd spotted the man outside Birchwood Elementary the day before, lingering too long after dismissal, pretending to scroll his phone while his eyes traced the fence line. She remembered the logo on his cap, a faded Rock Ridge Feed Company, and Mark had recognized it immediately. One of the few farm co-ops still operating near the county border. Mark kept low as he stepped from the vehicle, Ranger following close behind. The leash was loose in his hand, unnecessary. Ranger didn't need sight. He needed trust, and he had Mark's. They crossed the park in silence. At 20 feet, the man noticed. At 10, he stood. And at 5, he ran. "Ranger, take," Mark commanded. The dog surged forward. He moved like a shadow through tall grass, his body low, blindfolded eyes forward, trusting only his ears and his memory of footsteps. The man didn't get far. Ranger launched just before the bench line, connecting mid-stride. The man collapsed hard, breath knocked from his lungs. Mark was there seconds later, cuffing the suspect while Ranger stood watch, chest heaving. The backpack had flung open during the scuffle. Photos scattered onto the wet ground, some printed on glossy paper, others in cheap Polaroid frames. Children, parks, schoolyards. Not just Birchwood, not just Madison. Hours later, inside the sheriff's station, 2 federal agents arrived. One was Agent Natalie Corbin, a tall woman with sharp features, dark brown skin, and a tone that cut through the air like flint. She wore a navy suit with rolled sleeves, and her ID badge swung slightly as she walked. Corbin had been with the Bureau for 15 years, known for her work dismantling predator networks across state lines. Her eyes lingered on the evidence table before she turned to Mark. "You did good," she said, "but this goes higher than your jurisdiction." Mark didn't flinch. "Will you get justice for the kids?" "We'll do everything we can." Mark glanced down at Ranger, lying quietly at his feet, his tail moving slowly. "He did most of it," Mark murmured. Corbin looked at the dog. "Is he actually blind?" Mark nodded. "Has been for years, still better than any dog I've worked with." Corbin crouched, extended a hand cautiously. "Thank you, Ranger." Ranger tilted his head, nose twitching, then gently lowered it to her palm. By the following week, Birchwood Elementary had resumed normal classes. The media had been kept mostly at bay thanks to Agent Corbin's quiet handling. Madison returned to school wearing a purple jacket and a smile that wasn't quite whole, but it was real. April watched her from the window of her classroom, heart lifting. At lunch, Principal Gerald Simmons made a surprise announcement over the loudspeaker. "We have a visitor joining us today," his voice echoed, "someone who protected one of our own." April stood near the main hallway, smiling as Ranger walked in beside Mark. A group of 2nd and 3rd graders gasped in delight. Madison sat still at her cafeteria table until Ranger approached, then she stood. She walked slowly over and hugged the blind German shepherd, wrapping her arms around his thick neck, her cheek pressing gently into the fur beneath his blindfold. "Thank you," she whispered. Emily Dawson watched from across the room. 10 years old, still quiet, but braver now in small ways. She walked over, stood beside Ranger, and ran her fingers along his side. "I want to be like him when I grow up," she whispered to her dad, who stood quietly nearby. Mark smiled, his throat catching. "You already are." That evening, as the sun dipped below the wheat fields once again, a gathering formed near the old town square. There were no speeches, no parade, just a wooden bench freshly built beneath the old oak tree, carved with careful letters that read, "In honor of Ranger, who never needed eyes to see what mattered." Candles lined the ground. Children left drawings, mittens, toy bones. Madison placed her silver blanket on the bench. Emily left her map. April sat beside Mark, watching the town gather quietly. "Sometimes," she said, "the loudest heroes never say a word." Ranger lay between them, head resting on his paws, ears flicking toward laughter in the distance. He didn't move, but his tail tapped twice. Sometimes the quietest voices carry the greatest courage. Ranger couldn't see, but he never stopped believing. He listened to something deeper than sight, a whisper from within, a pull that many might call instinct. But we call it grace. In a world full of noise, this blind dog reminded us that the most powerful guidance doesn't always come from what we see, but from what we feel, from faith, from love, and sometimes from something greater than ourselves. This story isn't just about a missing girl or a heroic dog. It's about the unseen hands that guide us, protect us, and move us forward when we feel lost. Maybe that's not chance. Maybe that's God at work, through pause, through people, through silence. So, if this story touched your heart, share it with someone who needs to believe in quiet miracles again. Leave a comment below and tell us, have you ever felt God working in a way you couldn't explain? And if you believe that Ranger was more than just a dog, if you believe he was heaven sent, then type Amen in the comments. Subscribe to our channel for more true stories of faith, courage, and second chances. And may God bless you and your loved ones, today and always.